So today is October 7, 2017, and we're in the Feast of Tabernacles discussing logical fallacies. So before we get into things, let's ask our Heavenly Family to bless us. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for everyone here and for everyone who is interested in truth and cares to find what truth really is. Please help us to play our part in this world. Help us to understand the right way to think and the right way to interact with each other. Help us to love each other and to be rid of all fallacious thinking, both in regard to examining beliefs and claims, and also in regard to how we think about each other. So thank you so much for this message that you've given to us. Help us to advance in this discussion. Thank you. We ask this B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so logical fallacies. I've been really enjoying this whole series of discussions. So last night we talked about two fallacies, proof by assertion and proving too much. These are just two fallacies. We discussed them last night. Really great discussion. We've discussed many more. I won't go and recap all the fallacies that we've looked at in our discussions so far. But again, last night we discussed those two, proof by assertion, which is essentially simply restating the position as though that is evidence for the position. And the other one is proving too much, which is making an argument which, if it were true, would also, by means of consistency, demonstrate something else that is either undesirable or something else that is known to not be true. So we went through several examples of that, and then we got into discussion of different elements related to God and eternity and ultimate origins and things like that at the end. So that was all very, very interesting. Going through this whole discussion of logical fallacies has been very beneficial in many ways. I think I would hope for all of us. I know for many of us at least, because several have expressed it. But I want to repeat something that I said last night regarding the importance of understanding logical fallacies for those of us who proclaim this message. And that is that if we are committing logical fallacies, we will be giving a very poor representation of what this message is all about. And we cannot expect people to really listen to what we have to say if we are presenting it riddled with logical fallacies. Even if we just have one logical fallacy mixed in with a presentation of valid evidence, that one fallacy may provide someone with a temptation to think that everything that we're saying is worthless. Now, of course, that would not be valid on their part, to do that. But, again, it could give them that temptation. And the fact of the matter is that we have all committed so many logical fallacies, and I mean, it's just really bad, and we need to learn not to do that. So in this message so far, we have learned that we have believed many false things. But now we are talking about the fact that we have believed false things for poor reasons, and perhaps even better put, fallacious reasons. So in going through these logical fallacies, we want to consider the basic meaning of the fallacy. We want to look at examples of the fallacy. And in those examples, we want to consider instances where this fallacy may be easy for us to understand because the example may be on a subject or related to a subject not particularly relevant for us, so we might not have a bias. But we also want to look at examples that may be very relevant for us, and in those instances it may be more difficult to see at first, but it may be that those instances are the instances which we need the most. Now, I want you guys to be really thinking deeply about these logical fallacies as we go through them. And as you guys have noticed, after I go through a fallacy, explain what it is, give some examples, I'll ask you guys if there are questions or comments. Definitely feel free to ask questions, and if you have comments, make comments. In some of our past studies, some of you have given additional examples or asked if a particular thing is an example of that fallacy. I think that's great. I think that's awesome. So if you guys think of more or wonder if something's a particular fallacy, and also I'll say if you think of areas, different topics of discussion where you think that we might be prone to committing logical fallacies in general or a particular logical fallacy, feel free to mention that too. So, all that said, does anyone have comments or questions before we look at our first fallacy for the evening? All right. So, the first fallacy that we are going to look at is red herring. I'm sure you are all familiar with the name, although perhaps you may be less familiar with the idea of a red herring. So, kind of tracing the origin of this term and how it relates to the fallacy, essentially a red herring is a kind of dried fish with a very pungent smell. And in fox hunting, hounds are prevented from catching the fox by distracting them with the strong scent of a red herring. Similarly, a person can be stopped from proving his point in an argument by distracting him with an irrelevant issue. So that's basically what a red herring is. A speaker attempts to distract an audience or their opponent by deviating from the topic at hand by introducing a separate argument the speaker believes is easier to speak to. So, as I mentioned in previous discussions, I've looked for examples, and I found some from the internet. If you just type in a particular logical fallacy and then the word examples, so red herring examples, into a search engine, you'll find many different things. Wikipedia has examples for many fallacies. There's another wiki page or wiki site called Rational Wiki, and they often have examples for these logical fallacies. There's a website called Your Fallacy Is. There's several other websites that you'll come across if you just look for examples. And if you do that, you'll probably come across some of the examples that I'll give here, because some of these I'm taking from just various websites, again, Wikipedia, Rational Wiki, Your Logic Is, or whatever. Wherever I find an example that I think is very useful in highlighting the essence of the fallacy.
Is there a Your Logic Is or Your Fallacy Is?
I think it's Your Fallacy Is. Okay. Sorry if I said it incorrectly, both or one of the times.
Just the second time you said Your Logic Is. I just wanted to make sure that there was more than one site.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm pretty sure it's Your Fallacy Is rather than Your Logic Is. So, yeah, you guys can check it out. You'll find things. I haven't just been going with examples online. I've been, making other examples that are particularly relevant for our own world of this message. So, one example that I found online is as follows. A teacher catches a student cheating during a test. The student in response says, "I know I've made a mistake, but think of my parents. They're going to kill me." The student uses a red herring in his response. He tries to appeal to pity to distract his teacher from the real issue. So really, it's a separate issue. I mean, yeah, you can say it's related because his cheating is what would bring about the disciplinary action from his parents. But the teacher is addressing him on his cheating, not on the consequences of his cheating. That's a separate issue. So bringing up the consequences of what might happen to him if he gets in trouble is a red herring. It's not addressing the actual issue of his cheating. So, here's another one that I found online. An example of someone committing a red herring fallacy. When you start saying things to me like I need to eat healthier or get more exercise, that says to me that you think I'm fat. I like me and I like the way I look, and more people should have better self-esteem. Okay, so I use this example in particular because it relates more to day-to-day personal interaction, which is really, really good. I mean, we should try to think of logic fallacies in those settings in addition to discussing claims. So here someone may feel offended from someone saying to them that they should eat healthier and exercise, and then they start talking about how people should have better self-esteem and how it makes them feel, when really that's aside from the issue. So if a doctor says this to an overweight patient and the patient replies with this sort of thing, it's really a red herring. It's not dealing with what really needs to be dealt with. So now a couple examples that are more relevant for this particular message. Now, these are not necessarily examples that people here would be prone to give, although it's possible. But we may encounter people committing fallacies like this when we communicate different aspects of the message, or if someone asks us questions regarding to different things that we may discuss on the calls. So here's the first of these examples. One person may say, there are passages in Exodus and Leviticus which promote slavery. The other person replies, but God loves everyone. That's a red herring. God loving everyone really does not have anything to do with whether or not there are passages in Exodus and Leviticus which promote slavery. And so that's just throwing something totally different in there when really it's not even on point. Another example, one may say, since people use faith as a method for forming many contrary beliefs, it is an unreliable method. Another person may reply by saying, but everyone has a right to believe whatever they want. And just so you guys know, that is a very common reply to that sort of thing. If someone says that faith is not a reliable method for arriving at beliefs, at accurate beliefs, it's very common for people to respond by saying things like, well, everyone has a right to believe anything they want. That is a total red herring. I mean, yes, people do have a right to believe whatever they want, but that has nothing to do with whether faith is a reliable method for arriving at true beliefs. So we have to be very careful not to do this. It's obviously very easy to commit fallacies like this. It happens all the time, but we have to be aware of these fallacies and not commit them. So that's the last of the examples that I have for this particular fallacy. Does anyone have any comments or questions before we move on to the next one?
I have a possible example of a red herring.
Okay.
And I don't know if this is one, but one of the things that I have run across a lot is, saying the Holy Spirit is feminine. I've heard a few times people say, why do you care so much? Or what does that matter? And, it's like a totally different question. I mean, I answer that question gladly, but it's I don't know, I feel like it's kind of like a red herring going in a different direction, like you're now defending something kind of else other than the Holy Spirit being feminine.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely an example. Whether or not it's true that the Holy Spirit is feminine is separate from whether or not it is important or why it might be important or why it's important to a particular person. And so, yeah, often people, when they're presented with evidence in favor of a position which they are not inclined automatically to accept, they will often change the subject away from examining the evidence in favor of the position and go to things like, well, why does it matter? Or go to things like, the consequences of, oh, well, if I believe that. And there's another fallacy, actually, that we haven't discussed yet called the slippery slope fallacy, which is where someone ends up basically arguing that if you accept a certain position, then it leads to another thing, and that leads to another thing, and that leads to another thing. And since the conclusion is undesirable, well, then we can't accept the first thing. So, if we accept that the Holy Spirit is feminine, then that's like paganism, and that is going to lead us to like Satan worship and all these other things.
Some people claim it's going to lead to homosexuality, which is so ridiculous.
Right.
So ridiculous.
Exactly. Oh, the Holy Spirit's feminine. Oh, that'll lead someone to promote women's ordination, and that'll lead someone to promote, like gay marriage in church, and that'll...
Like they're related at all.
Exactly. So that's the slippery slope fallacy. And you can see it's actually basically a form of red herring in a sense, because the consequences of the claim, if it is true, are separate from whether the claim itself is true. So, yeah, there are many, many different forms that this red herring fallacy can take, but definitely the example that you gave, Mary, is totally a valid example of the red herring fallacy. All right, well, since I'm not hearing any other comments or questions, we'll move on to the next fallacy, which is the bandwagon fallacy, the belief that an argument is valid because a majority of people accept it. Now, for this one, there are so many examples that one might give, and one thing that I looked up in seeking examples for this fallacy are common misconceptions. And I encourage you guys to Google common misconceptions and see what you find. Common misconceptions are things which are very likely to be believed and to be argued for on the basis of the bandwagon fallacy. Oh, well, come on, everyone says that. Everyone knows that this is true. So one apparently common misconception, I'd have to look into this more to find out really what the facts are, but something that I found listed as a common misconception is the idea that Napoleon was short. And apparently he was actually 5'6", which was slightly above average height for a Frenchman of the time. So maybe he wasn't actually short. Now, people might say, oh, of course Napoleon was short. I mean, everyone knows that. Well, if someone says Napoleon was short, everyone knows that. That's committing the bandwagon fallacy. Another one, the sun is yellow. Come on, everyone knows that the sun is yellow. Well, just because everyone thinks that the sun is yellow, or many people do, doesn't mean that it actually is. The sun, by the way, isn't yellow. The sun actually is white, and it's quite clear when it's noon and it's shining from, the highest point in the sky. It's all white. If the sun was yellow, snow would be yellow, but no, it's actually white. It's just that when the sun is closest or closer to the horizon, the way that light comes through the atmosphere basically makes it so that the spectrum of the light that we see is more in the yellowy and orange range. Another common misconception, which people might be prone to use the bandwagon fallacy to support, is the idea that there is a dark side of the moon. There's not actually a dark side of the moon. There's a far side of the moon, because the moon is tidally locked with Earth. And so the same side of the moon is always facing Earth, but all the sides of the moon get sun exposure. But someone might say, well, of course there's dark side of the moon. And, if someone tries to bring up the fact that there isn't, someone may commit this bandwagon fallacy in order to promote that it is. Basically just saying everyone knows it or everyone believes it. Other common misconceptions, one is that we only use 10% of our brains. That's not actually true, but it's repeated a lot, so people are inclined to think that it's true because it's repeated a lot. And we might say, well, the majority of people believe it, so that must be the case. When in reality it's not true, we actually use all of our brains. A related one is thinking that there are left-brained people and right-brained people. That's not true either. We all use all of our brains, unless there's some sort of, if someone has brain damage or something like that, of course, that's a different scenario. But generally speaking, for healthy people, we all use all of our brains, and many tasks require different areas of our brain from both hemispheres to complete that task. Now, there are certain activities which require the heavy use of one portion of the brain over another, and those activities may be related to using a certain part of your brain that is only in one side. It is true also that moving my right arm is something that's controlled by my left hemisphere, and moving my left arm is controlled by my right hemisphere. So there are interesting things that you can do, experiments that can be run with having one eye closed, the other open, and using one particular hand to draw something or whatever, because information is only being taken in through one side of the body, which is controlled by one hemisphere. But things are connected, like your two hemispheres are actually connected, and it's very important that they are. I mean, there are people who have split brains where their hemispheres are disconnected from each other, but that's a whole other issue. But anyway, that's a common misconception, and people may repeat it and try to strengthen the belief based on the fact that it's a popular belief. But something being a popular belief does not mean that it is true. So these examples so far have been on relatively minor points. However, I wanted to mention them just to let you guys know that there are many common misconceptions out there, and I encourage you guys to look it up, because you may end up repeating a lot of common misconceptions thinking that they're actually true, when in fact they might not be. I mean, as I was looking at a few of them today, some of them that I came across, I hadn't actually heard. And so, like, you know, apparently it's a common misconception, and like apparently Einstein actually excelled in math. Like a lot of people say he failed in school and whatever, he was so bad at math, and apparently not, he wasn't. Apparently he was actually excelling in math as a young man or a young boy, and you know, so there's a lot of things like that. I encourage you guys to look it up. One example that I will give that is kind of more keyed into the things that we normally talk about is the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. A lot of people may be prone to say, of course Moses wrote the Pentateuch. I mean, we all know this. Like, we've all been saying it. People have known this for like 2,000 years or more. And, you know, just kind of repeating that everyone knows it. So as though that should be like the automatic standard idea just because everyone thinks that it's true. And it's a way to shift the burden of proof. To say, oh, well, you have to prove that Moses didn't write it, when really they haven't even evidenced that Moses did write it. Just the fact that the majority of people think that he did is not evidence that he did. So what do you guys think? Can you think of any more examples of this bandwagon fallacy?
I mean, definitely. I posted something the other day on I Support the Ordination of Women. Someone brought up the just gender of the Godhead kind of issue. I don't remember exactly what it was. And so I just said, well, or, you know, that God is a father, which is a male, and Jesus is a son, which is a male. And do we need a mother here? The Holy Spirit, mother? And see, you know, Genesis 1:26, Romans 1:20, blah, blah. Just post, that's it. And immediately someone posted like, oh, my husband and I were just wondering that. We were just talking about that. Then, 40 things. People like, no, God is genderless. There's no gender. Well, at the end of that, the person who initially was the first one to comment and said, yeah, we were wondering that. It's very interesting. Went on the bandwagon and was like, yeah, God can't have a gender. God is probably both genders or whatever, but I didn't say anything else, but it was just sad to see the bandwagon, happen right on Facebook right before my eyes. So.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. That is sad though, kind of witnessing it live, and I guess a bandwagon and peer pressure are kind of connected. Like, it's really like a social pressure or social influence. That's really what the bandwagon fallacy is someone giving in to that socially accepted idea because it's socially accepted or because it's popular. So that's too bad. But yeah, definitely that issue, gender in the Godhead is one, whether God is physical or not. another one that crossed my mind as you were saying that is for a long time people argued that Jesus was a Christian. And of course he's a Christian. Everyone knows Jesus is a Christian. I mean, that sort of argument is the whole bandwagon fallacy idea. But I really appreciate the example that you gave because it more vividly explains kind of the process of it and how it actually happens, where, there's a lot of people repeating the same idea, and then people end up kind of giving into it in a sense. Are there any other comments or questions concerning this fallacy, or does anyone else want to give another example of it?
Well, would another one be, we may have already discussed it, so I'm sorry if we have, but a couple of things are coming to my mind that have been brought up in conversation with others, and one is the Pentateuch, and the answer to that was, just like very close-minded, and said, oh no, the quote-unquote church has already looked into that, and it's just not accepted that could possibly be, when they weren't willing to examine it themselves. So would that be an example of a red herring, changing the subject from conversation back and forth, and what do you think, what could you investigate, would you be willing to investigate? It's like, no, it's already been done. Would that be one?
It depends on exactly how someone phrases their statement. If they just say the church has already decided, and especially if they say something like the church as a body or something like that, that's definitely an example of the bandwagon fallacy for sure. If they say the church has decided, but what they're referring to is like the Biblical Research Institute or something like that, then it's another fallacy called appeal to authority. But in either case, it is a logical fallacy, and if someone says, this is Seventh-day Adventist belief, it must be true because the whole church knows this and believes this and all of that, any instance of that is definitely the bandwagon fallacy. And there's a closely related one also called identity fallacy, where something is viewed as wrong simply because it is not viewed as being part of a certain identity, very often a group identity. So, that's not Seventh-day Adventist, therefore it's wrong. Well, that's the identity fallacy. So there are different forms. Someone could give a very similar kind of argument to the one that you're mentioning, and it could be technically classified as one of several different fallacies depending on exactly what they say.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so if there are no other comments or questions on this fallacy, we'll move on to the next one. All right, so the next fallacy is called special pleading, where a proponent of a position attempts to cite something as an exemption to a generally accepted rule or principle without justifying the exemption. So an example of this I found on the internet is, yes, I do think that all drunk drivers should go to prison, but Your Honor, he is my son. He is a good boy who just made a mistake. Okay, so that's, that would be a very easy fallacy to commit, but again, it's just that special pleading, but because of this personal relation, but it's not actually justifying why there should be an exemption. Now, obviously, there are instances where there are justified exemptions to things, but they need to actually be justified rather than just, well, this is special to me, so therefore. So that's one instance. Another one that we kind of touched on before, I think last night we ended up discussing something very much along these lines, but I'll kind of discuss it in its more formal setting now. There is an argument for God, or a series of arguments in favor of the existence of God, called the cosmological argument. And there are different forms of this. There's the Kalam cosmological argument. There's the Thomistic cosmological argument. And they're all, nuanced in different ways, but they have the same basic meaning and same basic structure. So, like, the basic way in which the argument goes is like this. Everything that comes into being must have a cause. An infinite regress of causes is impossible. We must therefore arrive at a first cause. This first cause is God. So that's basically the argument. It's saying, like, oh, well, everything has a cause, and so there had to be some sort of initial cause, because you can't just keep going back with a cause and a cause and a cause and a cause and a cause. So there had to be some initial uncaused cause. So people make that argument. That's the basic form. The Kalam version of this argument is kind of the most simple form, and there's just 3 steps to it. First is everything that exists or begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Second, the universe exists and began to exist. Third, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. So that's making this argument that the universe had to have a cause, and then the person will say, well, that the cause is God. First of all, that argument doesn't at all say anything about God, even though it's used as that. It is, like, the argument is an argument in favor of God, but the thing that's really silly about it is that it doesn't actually, like, even if the argument was valid, it wouldn't actually prove God, because all it proves is some sort of cause. That's all. Like, that's all it could show, but it doesn't say what that cause is. So there's a lot of different problems with the cosmological argument in its various forms that people go on to say, well, if the universe had a cause, then the cause had to be something outside of the universe. So it's an extra universal cause, which means that it's outside of space-time. No space, no matter, no time, and so it's some supernatural thing, and therefore God. That's how people argue it sometimes. But again, one of its many problems is the fact that it is an instance of special pleading. You're starting off by saying that everything that exists or begins to exist has a cause of its existence. And then the very conclusion of your argument is to say that there is an uncaused cause, a.k.a. God. Well, if God didn't need a cause for his existence, why don't we just say the same thing about the universe? If there didn't have to be something external to God that brought God into existence, why couldn't there be nothing causing the universe to exist from outside it? So, it's really special pleading. It contradicts its own first premise by saying that, oh, actually there is something. There's an exception to this rule. God didn't have to, come into existence. He just always existed. And the whole argument is based on the premise that everything which exists or begins to exist has a cause of its existence. So that's an instance of special pleading. Another one is very, very similar to something we've talked about at least twice now in our discussion of logical fallacies, and that's the whole issue of complexity. And people often view complexity as being an evidence for the existence of God. They'll say things like, complexity necessitates a creator. Well, there are some big problems with that, and one of the many, there are more problems with that type of statement than what I am about to mention. But one of the problems is that it is an instance of special pleading. If you posit a God as an explanation for complexity, that God must evidently be complex. And so if complexity requires a designer or a creator, well, if God is complex, then God requires a designer or a creator. And then whoever that designer or creator would be, the guy who made God or whatever, or the girl who made God, that being would also be complex and require a creator. And you can just keep going back and back and back and back and back and back, getting infinitely more complex and requiring more and more creators and creators and creators. So people make an exception when they say complexity requires a creator. Complexity is evidence that something was created. And yet don't apply that to God. God is just somehow magically exempt from that rule. So that's the logical fallacy of special pleading, or that's an example of the fallacy of special pleading. Does anyone have any comments or questions on any of this?
The thing that comes to my mind, and I think I've commented in a similar fashion in times past when we've talked about similar subjects. But, some people some Christians would have a really hard time, and not even just Christians. I just keep finding remnants of this little bubble thinking in my brain here. But people who believe in God or a God or gods would have a really hard time with that, sometimes thinking that, well, if this is true, if this way of thinking logically is true and it really is logical, it really is reasonable, well, if the universe, like if you were to say that just because the universe is complex, that argument doesn't work, that means it requires a creator because God is complex too, well, then that would require God having a creator. Well, but if we say that if God wasn't created, then logically, if we're using equal weights and measures, we'd have to say, well, there's no necessity because of complexity that the universe had a creator. Does that mean you're saying that the universe is God? Or that, are you saying that God was created? Or are you saying that there is no God? Like all these jumps in conclusion will take place because I've been there. I've been like, wait a minute, how could that be? I can't controvert the rationale because it's clearly rational. It's double standards to use a difference on special pleading. But yet, because I was raised a certain way, my brain just was like, those two ways of thinking then must not be able to coexist. A belief in God and no special pleading just based on complexity. And, so it took more time to look into things and understand how the logic is working and what is being said and what is not being said. There's differences, and we just, if we don't have experience practicing logical thinking, ironic, as Davidians we should, we're counseled by Victor Houteff to be logical thinkers, not bait hunters, to be real people, logical thinkers, but we've missed it. And so the devil will certainly try to then say, oh, well, what that is saying is that, well, it could be different things for different people. Like sometimes he'll say something like, well, that's saying that there's no God then. Well, if the universe didn't need a God, well, then there can't be a God. Well, that's not true. And that's not even the point of the fallacy anyway. It's not what the fallacy is pointing out. So I really want to encourage everyone to pay attention to what is being said and what is not being said.
Absolutely. That's good. I'm glad you're mentioning this. It's kind of like you're highlighting the temptation to commit other fallacies in response to this fallacy. So one thing would be to commit the fallacy fallacy, which would be to say, oh, well, an argument for God, for the existence of God, is a false argument. Therefore, the conclusion that a God exists is a false conclusion. That's the first fallacy we went through in this whole series, the fallacy fallacy. And so if someone is listening to this and thinking, oh, man, yeah, whoa, Trent's right. It's a logical fallacy, special pleading to say that complexity requires a creator, and then you somehow just
God's exempt.
Yeah, God is exempt from that rule. That's a fallacy. Oh, no, God must not exist. Well, no, that would be the fallacy fallacy. That would be saying because someone gave a bad argument for God, then their conclusion is false. That doesn't make sense. People give bad arguments for right conclusions. Now, of course, I'll also add that when they are making this argument, the cosmological argument, especially in its Kalam version, is specifically arguing for an extra universal being as God, a being outside of time and space. Now, in that instance, that conclusion is actually a false conclusion as well, but not because they gave a bad argument for it. It's false for other reasons. And then the other fallacy that one might be tempted to commit, that you were highlighting, Teresa, is the straw man fallacy of saying, so really the straw man argument, and we'll be getting to this, the straw man argument is where you misrepresent someone's position in order to more easily knock it down, basically. So someone may end up committing a straw man fallacy, where really my genuine position in what I'm saying right now concerning the argument for God based on complexity is that it is a bad argument. I'm saying that it is an instance of a logical fallacy called special pleading. Now, if someone may then misrepresent what I'm saying and say, oh, Trent's saying that God doesn't exist because, you don't need complexity, or you don't need a creator to make complexity, and that he's saying that it's logically fallacious to say that you need God because the universe is complex. So therefore he's saying that there is no God. Well, that would be misrepresenting what I'm saying. That would be using a straw man fallacy. And so, there's many logical fallacies that someone could commit in response to this. So I second everything that Teresa just said, and I wanted to kind of point out that really what she was just saying there is pointing out the fact that we may be tempted to commit logical fallacies in response even to the very things that I'm saying now. So are there any other comments or questions on any of these issues before we move on to the next fallacy? All right, we will go on to the next fallacy then. And the next one is straw man. Misrepresenting an opponent's stance in order to refute that false argument and create the illusion that one has defeated the opponent. An example of this that I found online is as follows. After Will said that we should put more money into health and education, Warren responded by saying that he was surprised that Will hates our country so much that he wants to leave it defenseless by cutting military spending. What a way to misrepresent the position of the other. So in politics, you can see straw men a lot. You can also see red herrings a lot. So that's just one example. Anytime that someone is misrepresenting someone else's view in order to disprove it, that's a straw man. So the idea, of course, it's like, someone for practicing boxing, let's say, someone could have a straw man, like a straw figure that they're using to box against. Oh, that's very different than boxing a real person, maybe for practice or whatever, but it's not the same. So if someone was to, say, oh, I'm going to defeat this boxer out there, and then they just really beat up a straw man, and then say that they defeated the actual boxer, that would be fallacious. Like, that is really like the straw man. But really, anytime someone misrepresents someone else's position and then attacks the misrepresentation and then acts as though they actually disproved the person's real position, that's the straw man fallacy. So if you go to an anti-Rod sermon, you will hear, basically the whole thing, for the most part, ends up being one big straw man fallacy. Oh, Davidians, they say this, and they believe that, and, they say that someday they're going to come and they're going to slaughter all the Seventh-day Adventists, and, yeah, sure, it's easy to say that that's a ridiculous position, because it is, but that has nothing to do with what Davidians actually believe, and it has nothing to do with what the Shepherd's Rod actually teaches, because it's simply a misrepresentation. So that's a straw man fallacy. People have committed the straw man fallacy in regards to positions which we advocate. For example, we have frankly admitted and stated that we do not know of anything within the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the New Testament, which indicate that their authors claimed to be divinely inspired. That's just a statement of fact. And to our knowledge, no one has been able to point out anything within those Gospels that shows that their authors claimed divine inspiration. But people have misrepresented the statements that we have made and said, you teach that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not inspired. Mm-hmm. Prove it. Okay, well, that's just a straw man. It's misrepresenting the position to begin with in order to attack it and to say, oh, can you believe it? Those guys are saying that these books in the Bible are not inspired. No, that's not actually what we have said. It's a very different thing to say these books are not inspired versus saying we don't know of anything from within these writings which claim inspiration. So that's just another example.
Another way of putting that would be if we were to say we don't believe that they are inspired, a person would say, you believe they're not inspired, and that's not true. Exactly. And people have a hard time with that. They'll say, well, it's either one or the other.
False dilemma fallacy. Yeah.
It's either one or the other. It's like, no, that's not the only two options. So it does take an effort to get out of the habit of these logical fallacies, because most of the time you don't realize you're even doing them. And so, yeah, it takes education and retraining our way of thinking, because we've been in a wrong way of thinking for so long. You have to form new habits, So it requires an effort, is what I'm getting at. You can't just say, oh, yeah, I agree with everything that's been said in these studies about logical fallacies. I recognize those are all logical fallacies, and then not continue to study into what logical fallacies are and examples of them, and to think of what you're doing. Am I committing any logical fallacies? There's the whole self-examination opportunity.
Absolutely. This is a great opportunity for self-examination.
But if we don't actively do that, we'll just keep committing logical fallacies.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're committing logical fallacies, we don't understand the truth. And if we don't understand the truth, then we don't even have the truth. And the truth is what will set us free. So we need to have the truth, which means we need to learn how to not commit logical fallacies, for one thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to give another example here, and the example is one that I found on enkivillage.org, and I just mentioned it because it's a really good example, and I was like, I should give these guys specific credit, and they have their web page on strawman fallacy is very good. It's very like they mentioned some examples, and they have a little video explaining it. So I'm wondering, actually, Teresa, would you mind reading just that first part? So basically, we're going to reenact this fallacy. Teresa will be the voice of one person. She's going to be stating something, and then I'm going to give the reply. And the reply that I'm going to give her is where the logical fallacy is. I'm going to be committing a straw man fallacy against her position.
Mandatory prayer in public schools is a bad idea because it violates separation of church and state, which is important for the following reasons, etc.
Now, I reply, it's clear from your argument that you're really advocating for atheism, but we've seen what state-sanctioned atheism does to societies. Look at Russia under Stalin or China under Mao. Is that what you want for this country? The suppression of religious freedom and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state?
No.
Right. So you guys see the straw man fallacy there, right? It's like, okay, so this person is just advocating for separation of church and state, and this person is like, oh, no, what you're really advocating for is atheism, and they're kind of mixing in a slippery slope as well, like, oh, this is going to lead to that, and it's going to lead to that, and we know what it's like under, Stalin, Russia, and China under Mao. I mean, that's basically what they're getting at. So it's really a misrepresentation. I want to do another one of these things where Teresa will play one part, as it were, and I'll play the other part. One moment, it just started to rain a little harder. Okay, so I hope that the rain doesn't distract too much here. So Teresa is going to be one voice, I'm going to be the other. It's a conversation that I found online, so this is not an example I made, but it's a good example of the straw man fallacy. And so
I'll start.
Yeah, you'll start.
What is your view on the Christian God?
I don't believe in any gods, including the Christian one.
So you think that we're here by accident, and all this design in nature is pure chance, and the universe just created itself?
You got all that from me stating that I just don't believe in any gods?
Evidently.
So let me ask you guys, where was the straw man fallacy there?
It's the conclusions that Teresa, or the Teresa playing the part of the person, saying that, everything was created in some other way or whatever. I mean, there was no talk about creation, and so she threw that in there.
Exactly, yeah. It's, the part that she played there was basically misrepresenting the part that I played. The role that I was assuming was just saying, I don't believe in any gods, including the Christian one. And so now the role that...
So that means you think we got here by accident and everything just created itself.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But
that's what Ed said. Didn't have anything to do with creation.
Totally. So it's just misrepresenting the other person's views entirely. So this is very common for people to do that, where, so you don't believe in this, so you believe everything came by chance. And, a way that I kind of summarize that is, you're an atheist, so you say there's no God, or that's a kind of a different example, but it's a very similar one where people will say, you say that there's no God. Well, okay, that's, again, misrepresenting someone else's views. Another one, you're a scientist, so you think you know everything, do you? It's like, no, that's not really how it works. So any comments or questions on this fallacy? Any other examples that anyone wants to add?
I'm good. I don't have anything else to add.
All right, so I think we'll stop there for the night then. And, we can see about any other logical fallacies next week. And I encourage you guys, again, to continue looking into all of this and really examine yourself to see where you may be committing logical fallacies. So would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, thank you so much, again, for guiding us into these logical fallacies, and please help us to, like Teresa said, not overlook examining our own selves and how we have committed them in the past, and just to make sure we don't commit them in the future, and, again, to be understanding with those that do commit them against this message. Help us to be able to gently show them the error in their thinking, and please, sister, show us the error in our thinking. In the name of the branching and she, amen.
Amen. All right, everyone. Lila Tov. Love you all.
Happy feast.
Same to you.
Thank you. Good night.